I want to spend a few minutes just talking about some of the psychological impact of the current immigration policy, and also more broadly anti-immigrant sentiment that has been rising, as we all know. And in Sarang's presentation, you heard a great deal about the policy aspects of it. So the next step is to really think about, well, what does all of this mean for children, adolescents, adults who are coping with the current policy flux that we're in, as well as anti-immigrant feeling all across the country and in other parts of the world. So the first thing that I want to mention is that we need to understand the context from which many immigrants are arriving from, and think about why people choose to immigrate. And as we know, there are many different reasons. The primary reason why immigrants migrate and relocate to the United States actually has to do with family reunification, being with family and loved ones, seeking employment, seeking educational opportunities, but also more and more escaping poverty, war, persecution, and natural disasters. In terms of trying to understand the psychological impact of what it feels like to be an immigrant in the United States today, we also have to think about what was the nature of the migration, the pre-migration context left behind. So there are different reasons for why people seek help, but to really think about the fact that many immigrants have access to support within their countries of origin. However, when they come to the United States, there's already a great deal of dislocation psychologically regarding the separation from family and familiar social, cultural, and linguistic environments and contexts. Nonetheless, immigrants leave with the sense of hope and a sense of optimism, oftentimes a cautious sense of optimism for a better future for themselves and their family members and future generations. In the post-migration context, is often immigrants are met with a sense of hope, but also some disillusionment, particularly in the current context. So even though immigration really requires a sense of optimism on one hand, it coexists with a sense of disillusion and disorientation, particularly when there's xenophobia, anti-immigrant sentiment, and racism. And I'll talk more about the effects of racism in a few minutes. But particularly when things are in flux and feel unpredictable, all of a sudden there's a ban from predominantly Muslim countries, a travel ban. There's the ending of DACA, just constant sort of living with the unknown and the tremendous anxiety that that produces for immigrants and their families, particularly those who don't have documentation, but really also for those people who do have documentation, even those who are US citizens or have become US citizens or are second generation immigrants. Or children of immigrants. So in thinking about this context of migration and where first and second generation immigrants are sort of functioning within, there are pervasive stereotypes of what immigrants are like and who they are in the mainstream conceptions of immigrants. And one, of course, has to do with the fact that illegal immigration is overwhelming our nation. And you see in this cartoon, there's a fence and one side is the United States, the other side is Mexico. And in the United States side, you see all kinds of free things available, like free lemonade, free education, jobs, free healthcare, and so on. And on the other side, you see maps to the US, but you see people sort of coming under the fence as though they're sneaking in without permission and they're and without any rights. And then a big sign warning immigrants to stay out or keep out. You also see these kinds of images, right? Particularly with the Mexico and US border of people flooding in, stampeding into the US, that immigrants are taking our jobs and that they are frightening. So the other aspect of immigrants, particularly those from the Middle East, South Asia, who are perceived as frightening terrorists. Also that immigrants are somehow demanding that we all change our lives, that everybody who doesn't consider themselves an immigrant should change their life for the benefit of these immigrants. So if you look at this particular sign with the US flag, this person has written, "Why the hell should I have to press 1 for English?" So the debates around language and bilingualism, and what is English the only language that should be a national language in the US. But in looking at these images, I'd like you to pay attention to the language that we've been using in more recent years to describe immigrants. And you know, when you think about that, there has been a shift. And it's been a very calculated kind of shift, in my opinion, in terms of political usage of these words, certainly in the Trump campaign and beyond that. The ways in which immigrants are depicted and described as rapists, criminals, threatening, that they are not to be trusted, essentially. And in fact, more recently, the American Indian and Native American communities and allies who are protesting the Dakota Access Pipeline, the building of the pipeline in the Dakotas, are now being referred to by the current administration as domestic terrorists for interfering with the construction of the pipeline. So the ways in which language is used is really critical at the moment, because language will impact how one comes to be seen by others, but also how one can experience oneself in terms of the psychological and the intrapsychic effects of the current context. So I also want to draw attention to the fact that language is particularly important to think about historically, as in any kind of preceding incidents and context of fascism to white supremacy, slavery, genocide. All of these things started with the change of language, the reframing of and dehumanizing of human beings, and sort of reducing them to scapegoats, to less than or threatening to the pure kind of race or the pure ethnic group or religious group. Along with this language shifting come all kinds of projections in terms of people determining who others might be as human beings before they ever speak to them or know anything about them. And so we have a big problem in our country and elsewhere regarding the internalization of stereotypes. And these ideas do impact not just the way that we see others from a political standpoint, but also how we may interact with each other on a day-to-day basis, whether it's in an educational context or a clinical context, or an everyday interaction in social interactions. Immigrants typically undergo what we call acculturative stress in psychology and sociology. And acculturative stress refers to the stress that accompanies the immigration and adjustment to the new country. And discrimination is a component, it's an aspect of acculturative stress. So other types of acculturative stress might be language barriers, financial struggles, downward social mobility and economic mobility. But all of these different kinds of stressors are linked to psychological outcomes, and discrimination certainly being a key part of this, this problem. And we know that immigrants of color, people who become racial minorities upon migrating to the United States, even though in their countries of origin, they most likely were not considered racial minorities, they tend to experience higher levels of acculturative stress in the United States compared with immigrants who are white. So perhaps immigrants who are coming from European countries, Australia, Canada, and so on, who are white. There's also a newer type of acculturative stress, and over the past decade certainly, is the uncertainty of policy and deportation, and it's extremely heightened at this moment. There are now patients or clients whom I see in my practice who have asked to meet with me really solely based on their fear of deportation, that they're suffering panic attacks, they can't sleep at night, they're not sure what's going to happen next. And many of them are facing persecution in their countries of origin if they were to return. And they are exiles, they're refugees. There's also acculturative stress related to having to hide one's identity. So for many years, kids who were, or young adults who were on DACA, were dreamers, having to hide themselves, or family members who don't want their identity revealed to the outside world. So there's a lot of distrust of of others, questions around who is safe to talk to. Is there anyone who is safe to talk to in a workplace or an educational setting? Who is it safe to reveal immigration status to, or even talk about one's ethnic background? So in terms of some major presenting issues in clinical and educational contexts, we know that most immigrants tend to adapt well to their new living circumstances under non-traumatic circumstances. When we don't have this heightened anxiety about being deported or not knowing if we might be targeted for hate crimes or assaults or verbal attacks and so on. Under typical circumstances, we see that the second generation immigrants, in particular, the children of immigrants, struggle with psychological issues to a greater extent than the first generation, oftentimes related to problems of racism and discrimination. So I want to move us to looking at a couple of different types of presenting issues in clinical context, and in particular. One has to do with acculturation-based problems, that there are issues within families, within immigrant communities, where there might be shifts in roles and structures within a family related to gender or other aspects of identity, and also conflicts that occur within families, as the younger generation may have different worldviews culturally than the parent or the grandparent generation. We also have trauma-based presenting issues that relate to experiences of trauma that occurs before migration, during the journey and process, and beyond once somebody arrives to the US. This is often compounded by experiences of interpersonal violence, such as sexual violence, childhood abuse, and so on. I do want to focus lastly on discrimination and racism based presenting problems, because I feel that this is particularly heightened at this moment. We know that discrimination, profiling, the fear of deportation, all of these issues are causing a great deal of mental health issues. When we look historically in the United States, we have had a long history of racial trauma in this country that remains unacknowledged by many. For example, the Native American genocide, African slavery, internment camps of Japanese Americans, and ongoing racial profiling and violence, deportation, anti-immigrant sentiment and racism, anti-Muslim sentiment, and anti-Semitism. We have a lot of examples of this, and as many people want to believe that this is something that happened in the past, it's not as bad now. I think that we can all agree that we have seen sort of a resurgence of a lot of overt acts of racism and over the past year or two. But also in addition to that, the remnants of each of these different things that are listed here on this slide, each of these different types of racial trauma in the country are still with us in many ways. If you look at our social and economic structures and inequities, they are connected to these racial traumas. The experiences of racism, particularly cumulative experiences of racism, are related to all kinds of physical health problems as well as mental health problems. We have ample evidence in psychological research now that tells us that, in fact, racism is directly related to poor physical health outcomes as well as mental health outcomes, including high blood pressure, premature births, depression, anxiety, substance abuse, suicidal behavior, and family conflicts. We know this is true because it's been replicated over and over again over the past decade in particular with different ethnic minority and racial minority communities and participants in research studies. These are not mediated or moderated relationships. There's a direct impact of racism on these different outcomes. racism also affects one's identity and aspirations for the future. The ability to see oneself as someone who belongs in this country is a valued part of the fabric of the United States. And it affects children's ability to feel as though they are safe, not just physically, but also that they belong and have a future that is on par with their white peers. So broadly speaking, the impact of the current discrimination that immigrants face, but ongoing discrimination also, it contributes to an atmosphere of anxiety and fear. It's also important to note that it's not just overt forms of racism that are linked to these detrimental effects that I just mentioned, but also subtle forms of racism. And we see that the second generation, typically, these are children of immigrants, typically tend to report more distress related to racism. And there's also a feeling of a second-class person, or the feeling that one is a perpetual foreigner, and tendency also to then not seek out services, not seek out the help that one needs to cope with this stress.